you need some kicker help heading into Week 16. Here's a few kickers that could possibly get you over the hump and help you win a championship or a third-place game to place. The first one's Cairo Santos of the Chicago Bears. What a game Santos had versus the Minnesota Vikings yesterday. And he's a guy I recommended last week as well. He had 3 field goals, 36, 37, and 34. And then he hit a 45-yarder and 3 PATs. So he had 18 fantasy points. That's a huge game to get 18 out of him. And now in his last 2 games, he's had double-digit fantasy points. And in Week 16, he's got a great matchup at Jacksonville, who gives up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers. So Cairo Santos, he would be the first guy, and he's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. The second kicker, Nick Folk of the New England Patriots. Folk, he's been pretty good this season for the most part. And yesterday, he had a good game versus the Miami Dolphins with Folk with 15 fantasy points. He had a 37-yarder, 38, and a 31, and a 45. He was good for 15 fantasy points. And Folk now, he's reached 9 or more fantasy points in 4 out of his 5 last fantasy games. And in Week 16, he's got a good matchup versus the Buffalo Bills in a game where I could see him getting a bunch of attempts again, because this Bill defense, they're bend but don't break type of defense. I think the field goal attempts will be there for Folk, and he could have a good game. And he's available in 97% of fantasy leagues. The third kick is Greg Zuerlein of the Dallas Cowboys. Zuerlein a few weeks ago had a horrible game where he missed 4 field goals. But now the last 2 weeks, Greg the Leg's back on par with huge fantasy games. In Week 14, 14 fantasy points. And then this week versus San Francisco, he hit a 47-yarder, a 48-yarder, and he also hit 5 PATs. So Greg the Leg with 13 fantasy points. This week he versus Philadelphia in Week 16. That gives up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. And this Dallas offense, they leave a lot of points on the board as well, where they got to settle for field goals. And I think once again this week, Greg the Leg, he could get those field goal attempts and get double digits. And he's also available in 60% of fantasy leagues. The next kicker is Tyler Bass of the Buffalo Bills. This is probably the 8th or 9th time this season he's been on the waiver list for kickers. But Tyler Bass, once again, a pretty good game with a 28-yarder, a 27-yarder, and 6 PATs versus Denver in Week 15. And now he's got another good matchup versus New England, who gives up a bunch of fantasy points to kickers. He's available, Bass, still somehow in 53% of fantasy leagues, when he's one of the top kickers this season in fantasy points. If he's out there and you need a kicker, go get him. And the 5th and final kicker I recommend to get on waivers this week's Matthew Gay of the Los Angeles Rams. Matthew Gay, another week, another double-digit fantasy day versus the New York Jets with 10 fantasy points. He had a 47-yarder and a 48-yarder and 2 PATs, and he's available in 80% of fantasy leagues. And he's got a decent matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks here in Week 16 that give up a decent amount of fantasy points to kickers. And they're the type of defense where teams are going to have to settle at times for field goals. So I like Matt Gay there, and he's available in a bunch of leagues, like I said, at 80%. So that's a few kickers I would add on waivers this week heading into Week 16.